Hello, I'm Mahmoudul Hussain, and I'll be talking about climate justice. Climate justice addresses the division, fair sharing, and equitable distribution of the benefits and burdens of climate change and responsibilities to deal with it. Applied ethics, research, and activism using these terms approach anthropogenic climate change as an ethical, legal, and political issue rather than one that's purely environmental or physical in nature. This is done by relating the cause and effect of climate change to concepts of justice, mainly environmental justice and social justice. Climate justice examines concepts such as equality, human rights, collective rights, and the historical responsibilities for climate change. Climate justice actions can include the growing global body of legal actions on climate change issues. In 2017, a report on United Nations Environment Program identified 894 ongoing legal actions worldwide. Climate justice is a fundamental aspect of SDG 13 under UN Agenda of 2030. Conceptions of climate justice can be grouped along the lines of procedural justice, which emphasizes fair, transparent, and inclusive decision making, and distribution justice, which places the emphasis on who bears the cost of both climate change and the actions taken to address it. Working Group 2 of the IPCC now adds a third type of principle to climate justice recognition, which entails basic respect and robust engagement with and fair consideration of diverse cultures and perspectives. Alternatively, recognition and respect can be understood as an underlying basis for distribution and procedural justice. Some climate justice approaches promote transformative justice, where advocacies focus on how vulnerability to climate change reflects various structural injustices in society, such as the exclusion of marginalized groups from climate resilient livelihoods, and that climate action may explicitly address these structural power imbalances. Disproportionality between causality and burden. The responsibility for anthropogenic climate change differs substantially among individuals and groups. Studies find that the most affluent citizens of the world are responsible for the most environmental impacts, and robust actions by them is necessary for prospects of moving towards safer environmental conditions. The bottom half of the population is directly responsible for less than 20% of the energy footprint and consume less than the top 5% in terms of trade corrected energy. High income individuals usually have higher energy footprints as they disproportionately use their larger financial resources, which they can usually spend freely in their entirety for any purpose as long as the end user purchase is legal for energy intensive goods. In particular, the largest disproportionality was identified to be in the domain of transport, where for example, the top 10% consume 56% of vehicle fuel and conduct 70% percent of vehicle purchases. Aggravating the problem of injustice from disproportionate causality, many of the people and nations most affected by climate change are among the least responsible for it. A study projected that depending on scenarios, regions inhabited by 1 to 3 billion people could become as hot as the hottest parts of Sahara. The maximum, where the annual maximum temperature is more than 29 degrees Celsius within 50 years if there is no change in patterns of population growth. Climate change is not limited to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, and these people do not migrate. It found most of these affected regions to have little adaptive capacity as of 2020. One of the problems could be increased drought severity worldwide. While fossil fuel companies are often held responsible for anthropogenic climate change, the influences and negative effects on the environment may mainly stem from several other factors, such as consumers purchasing fossil fuels and goods produced using them, structures that distribute power and wealth to fossil fuel companies, lack of public and contemporary free private investment into sustainable development of renewable energies, lack of alternatives such as public transport infrastructure and advanced sustainable energy grids, lack of policies that reduce fossil fuel consumption or their harmful effects, lack of change development such as eco-friendly tariffs, new socio-economic designs, changes to subsidization, etc. Many policies and contemporary private endeavors, such as voluntary ones by billionaires or asset managers, may often have well-intentioned, substantial positive environmental effects, but these may amount to nothing or be greenwashing, as they may fall short of climate goals and policies, since politics often is based on compromise. Intergenerational equity. The current nation states and world population needs to make changes, including sacrifices like uncomfortable lifestyle changes, alterations to public spending, and changes to choice of work today to enable climate justice for future generations. Preventable severe effects are projected to likely occur during the lifetime of the present adult population. Under current climate policy pledges, children born in 2020 will experience over their lifetimes 2 to 7 times as many heat waves as well as more of the other extreme weather events compared to people born in 1960. This, along with other projections, raises issues of intergenerational equity, as it was these generations who have been mainly responsible for the burden of climate change. This illustrates uh, that the general fact that emissions produced by any given generation can lock in damage for one or more future generations, making climate change progressively more threatening for the generations affected than for the generation responsible for the threats. Crucially, the climate system contains tipping points such as the amount of deforestation of the Amazon that will launch the forest's irreversible decline, a generation whose continued emission drive the climate system past such significant tipping points inflict severe injustice on multiple future generations. Disadvantaged groups will continue to be disproportionately impacted as climate change persists. These groups will be affected due to inequalities that are based on demographic characteristics such as differences in gender, race, ethnicity, age, and income. Inequality increases the exposure of disadvantaged groups to the harmful effects of climate change while also increasing their susceptibility to destruction caused by the same thing. The damage is worsened because disadvantaged groups are the last to receive emergency relief and are rarely included in the planning process at local, national, and international levels for coping with the impacts of climate change. Communities of color, women, indigenous group, and people of low income all face a larger vulnerability to climate change. These groups will be disproportionately impacted due to heat waves, air quality, and extreme weather events. Women are also disadvantaged and will be affected by climate change differently than men. This may impact the ability of minority groups to adapt unless steps are taken to provide these groups with more access to universal resources. Indigenous groups are affected by consequences of climate change even though they historically have contributed the least to it. In addition, indigenous people are unjustifiably impacted due to their low income and they continue to have fewer resources to cope with climate change. The ability of populations to mitigate and adapt to the negative consequences of climate change are shaped by factors such as income, race, class, gender, capital, and political representation. Low income communities as well as colored communities possess little to no adaptive resources, making them more vulnerable to climate change. People living in poverty or in precarious circumstances tend to have neither the resource nor the insurance coverage necessary to recover from environmental disaster. On top of that, such populations often receive an unequal share of disaster relief and recovery assistance. Additionally, they generally have less say and involvement in decision making, political, and legal processes that relate to climate change and natural environment. Climate migrants are a subset of environmental migrants who were forced to flee due to sudden or gradual alterations in the natural environment related to one of the three main impacts of climate change: rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and drought or water scarcity. Climate change is often described as a threat multiplier that compounds crises over time and space. The United Nations Global Compact on Refugees state that while not in themselves causes of refugee movements, climate, environmental degradation, and natural disasters increasingly interact with the drivers of refugee movements. Climate migration relates to matters of political instability, conflict, and national security, as displaced people may be relocated to regions geographically vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and there are also both short and long term Effects of climate change. The cumulative impact of longer term effects may lead to political conflict, insurrection, poverty, and other socioeconomic disparities. There are three main common principles of justice and burden sharing that can be used in decision making related to who bears the larger burdens of climate change globally and domestically. Those who most cause the problems, those who have the most burden carrying ability, and those who benefited the most from the activities that cause climate change. Another method of deciding starts from the objective of preventing climate change. One example of how the concept of climate justice is relevant to policies and society is the problem of determining how fast a fossil fuel extraction phase out should be or how large the amount of unextractable fossil fuels in a country should be. Another example is the degree to which those who are considered to be the main causes of the problem of climate change should be enabled and allowed to hold on to their own wealth and power. For instance, some fossil fuel companies that freely invest into renewable energies to slowly transform into renewable energy companies. Climate change litigation, also known as climate litigation, is an emerging body of environmental laws using legal practices and precedent to further climate change mitigation efforts from public institutions such as governments and companies. In the face of slow politics of climate change delaying climate change mitigation, activists and lawyers have increased efforts to use national and international judiciary systems to advance their efforts. The main legal claims for climate litigation are constitutional laws that focus on breaches of constitutional rights by the state, administrative laws that challenge the merits of administrative decision making, private laws that challenge corporations or organizations for neglect, nuances, etc. Fraud or consumer protection challenges companies for misrepresenting information about climate impacts, and human rights claiming that failure to act on climate change fails to protect human rights. The climate movement is a global social movement focused on pressuring governments and industry to take action, also called the climate action, addressing the causes and impacts of climate change. Although its roots stem from the broader environmental movement, climate activism gained significant momentum in 2010s, mainly following the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2016. Some major protests have been listed below. Political approaches towards climate justice. The early 21st century, mainly the decade between 2020 to 2030, became the time in which both relatively large shares of populations in and outside of formal democracies realized that urgent, serious actions towards climate change mitigation, climate justice for young future generations need to be taken, and which scientific researches indicate to contain the last closing window of opportunity for mitigating climate change to a manageable, potentially justifiable level. Scientific data indicates that assuming 2021 emission levels, humanity has a carbon budget equivalent to 11 years of emissions left for limiting warming to 1.1 degrees Celsius. Although there are deep concerns over potential tipping points that would be triggered even before the carbon budget is used up, these are main reasons why many scientists are calling for the declaration of and critically adequate action upon a state of climate emergency. Some of the relevant elite groups, mainly WHO, IMF, World Bank, OECD, were found to have been incompetent or unwilling to solve climate change, making their rhetoric ultimately meaningless, partly by continuously including what some consider globalism and ethics of growth in the perpetuated rhetoric. In terms of political approaches, some researchers identified a need for participatory deliberative democracy model of political decision making in which voting related decisions are not made via polarized opinions sparked via possibly imperfect media and education and immediate near term impacts but gain their legitimacy via authentic deliberation. Citizen juries can be a deliberative democracy tool that allows a demographically representative sample of the population to learn about a contested issue from experts and discuss, debate, and develop policy recommendations. Human rights and climate change is a conceptual and legal framework under which international human rights and their relationship to global warming are studied, analyzed, and addressed. The framework has been employed by governments, United Nations organizations, intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations, human rights and environmental advocates, and academics to guide national and international policy on climate change under UNFCCC and the core international human rights instrument. In 2022, Working Group 2 of the IPCC suggested that climate justice compromises justice that links development and human rights to achieve a right-based approach to addressing climate change. There are many debates against climate justice. Some of them include disruption of social stability, jobs, and uncomfortable changes, public political support, perceivement injustice, conflict and legitimacy, fossil fuel dependent states, less ambitious mitigation, etc. Lastly, there's a climate clock that states the amount of time we have left to fight climate change before an extinction event occurs.